Welcome to the Single Point division of the Rouge Radio podcast, where we go one-on-one with a valued guest. And in this case, it is one-on-one because, Tony, we got a new job today. And we welcome the author of The Year of the Rocket, Mr. Paul Woods. Paul, thanks for taking time of your busy schedule, as I can see, to come on the program.
Well, thank you for having me, Robert. Much appreciated. Glad to be here.
Great. First off, I've been looking forward to having you on because, we're talking about off air. I've been a fan of sports related documentary type podcasts, and this seems, because I'm nostalgic as hell. Things that are happening back when I was growing up as a kid, and I just grew up in love. So I'm really looking forward to picking your brain here. The first thing here is because your Twitter bio says you're a noted Toronto Argonaut historian. So obviously, if you're an historian, you're a fan. So, Paul, how did you become a fan of the Canadian Football League and, of course, to an extent, the Toronto Argonauts?
Well, I grew up in London, Ontario. My dad was a big Argo fan. I didn't really follow any sports until I was about 10 years old, and then I got really excited about the Argonauts. This would be back in about 1968. It was the Leo Cahill era, the first Leo Cahill era. And the Argos were a really cool team. They were good. They were getting very competitive, but they were also basically the first pro sports team that I saw that had cool people. They had guys with long hair, and to a 10-year-old kid, that was a big deal. Guys with hair sticking up the back of their helmets, and I thought their uniforms looked really cool. And so I just became a big fan of the team back then. I got really serious about being a dedicated fan about a decade later. In about 1977, I just decided I'm going to go full bore. I'm going to become a really fanatical Argo fan, and I have been ever since. I've been following the team's fortunes incredibly closely ever since. So that's well, really more than 50 years, but more than 40 years of very intense fanatical following. And, I've had my ups and downs like any sports fan does, but I still love the Argos, and it's a lot of fun to be a fan, and it's a lot of fun to be helping tell their story in these books I've written.
You've turned that fandom into a career in the news. How difficult, when you cover the Argonauts, is it to separate the reporting aspect and your personal being a fan of the Toronto Argonauts?
Well, I was lucky that I didn't have to cover them very often. I was a journalist for the better part of the last 40 years, and but most of the time I had roles that did not require me to be a sports reporter or an Argo reporter. I did cover the Calgary Stampeders for 2 years, from 86 to 88. I was based in Calgary, and I was a full-time reporter for Canadian Press. And one of the jobs I had to do was go to Stampeders games and write about them. So there were a couple of Argo games in McMahon that I had to cover, and I had to put aside my fandom and just cover it like a journalist would. And I remember the first time I actually covered a football game was before I moved to Calgary in '86. I had to learn what it was like to cover football games. I'd been an editor mostly for the first 6 years of my career, and I hadn't really done a whole lot of reporting. So as I was getting ready to go to Calgary for this reporting job, I talked to my colleagues at Canadian Press and said, I better cover a football game before I leave. So I covered an Argo game at Exhibition Stadium against the TigerCats in the early part of the '86 season. So I got to go up to the press box, way up at the top of the old Exhibition Stadium, and then down into the locker room afterwards and get some quotes and stuff, and really got a chance to get into a scrum with Carl Brazeley, who was for many years my favorite player. So that was pretty cool, to be there and having him answering my questions and stuff. But luckily, I never had to really cover the team very often. I was at the '87 Grey Cup that the Argos played in as a journalist, and so that was a blast. And again, I had to observe the no cheering in the press box rule, and the same with the '96 Grey Cup. I was in that game in Hamilton, the Argos and the Eskimos in that great snow game. And so again, it was cool to be up there watching the game and to be part of the coverage experience and to go down into the locker room and talk to a whole lot of players and people associated with the team afterwards was a lot of fun. But I had to do it as a professional. I had to write, I had to get the whatever quotes were newsworthy and write the story as I saw fit. Fortunately, in '87, the Argos lost, but my job was to go into the Eskimos locker room afterwards. In '96, the Argos won, and I got to go into the Argos locker room afterwards, and that was a blast. But I was working. I wasn't. I got to enjoy it sort of on the drive home afterwards, and relive it by watching the videotape the next day or whatever. But at the game itself, I was working.
Okay, so on the DL here, you're a fan of the Argonauts. provincial rivals, the Hamilton TigerCats, who are currently going through the longest active Grey Cup drought. There's got to be somewhere inside you where you're like, stupid TigerCats, or is there any kind of sympathy or empathy that you have, because the Argonauts had something similar up until the 83 Grey Cup, where they ended that 31-year drought?
That's right. They ended the drought, the 31-year drought, by winning the Grey Cup in '83, which I wrote about in my first book, Bouncing Back. It's funny. Although obviously there's a lot of enmity between Argo fans and TigerCat fans, I've found that for the most part, it's not a lot of Argo fans really truly hate the TigerCats or their fans. I personally feel like these two teams are intertwined in it, and they need each other to be successful. We need ideally we'd have two strong franchises. We'd have a strong franchise in Toronto and a strong franchise in Hamilton, both off the field and on the field. That would be the best thing that could happen for football in Southern Ontario. We've had too many years where one team was good and one team was terrible, and so few years where both teams were good. The TigerCats are now, I guess this will be their 22nd year without a Grey Cup, because they're not going to win it this year. No TigerCats fans heard me say that, but yeah, I would like this. I'd like the team to be successful, and I will say this. I went to a lot of games at Ivor Wynne Stadium over the years, and there were some pretty rough experiences there where there was some pretty ugly confrontations between TigerCat fans and Argo fans. I haven't seen that at Tim Hortons Field. I've been to 4, 5, 6, 7 games there since Tim Hortons opened, and maybe because it's a nicer stadium, maybe because it's a younger crowd, I don't know why, but I don't sense the same kind of let's bite the ear off that Argo fan like happened at Ivor Wynne. So yeah, I'd like both teams to be successful. In an ideal world, they'd be fighting it out for first place every year, and that'd be great for promoting interest in this part of the world. Their interest is pretty good in Hamilton. It's not as good in Toronto as it needs to be, and if we could ever get the rivalry going where both teams were good every year, that would help.
Yeah, the interest in Toronto, we might get into that a little bit later. Let's focus on the book, The Year of the Rocket. You've been working on this project for about a few years now, obviously doing a lot of research. Was there anything that popped out to you, like that maybe something that you didn't remember correctly, or something that you didn't even know that popped out that you put in the book?
Well, lots of things that I didn't know, and that's even despite the fact that I followed the team very, very closely back then. I was living actually in Edmonton at the time. From 88 till 93, I was based in Edmonton, and so I wasn't around Toronto. Although I did get to go. I went to the Argos' first game that year in Ottawa, and I went to the home opener the following week, the famous game that had the Dan Aykroyd and the Elwood Blues Review, the sort of the former members of the Blues Brothers were there. Rocket's debut was there. I got to see, of course, the Argo game in Edmonton that August. So I was around the team, bits and pieces here and there, but mostly following it from a distance, but still following it incredibly closely, to the point where I videotaped just about every bit of news footage from on the sportscasts and so on, all of which became very helpful in writing the book. But yeah, I spent 4.5 years researching this and getting it written, and I learned all kinds of stuff I didn't know about. Some of them from some of the people I interviewed. Wayne Gretzky told me a really interesting story about Rocket Ismail and the challenges that he had dealing with the media. And I heard that's, you're hearing it directly from Wayne. It's a pretty good to get a story like that from a guy like that. So there's lots of interesting stuff in the book. A lot of it I did know, but a lot of it I didn't know. Many interesting anecdotes from people that were associated with the team, from players, coaches, the general manager, the ownership, Bruce McNall, Wayne Gretzky, John Candy's son and daughter, executives, other members of other teams, people from around the league, journalists. I spoke to more than 100 people and got umpteen perspectives on things, and it all got stitched together in this big jigsaw puzzle into the story, which I think is a hell of a story about what I think is the most crazy, magical, amazing year in almost a century and a half of Argonauts football. There's be things that happen that year that'll never be repeated. So to be able to capture it and tell the story is a real privilege.
There we go. And all right, so the Year of the Rocket, it centers around obviously the 1991 Grey Cup champions, the Toronto Argonauts, hence the Year of the Rocket, as we're coming on the 30-year anniversary of said game. But this story, and you kind of touched on it in the book a little bit, is that this kind of story starts a year before with the acquisition of quarterback Matt Dunnigan. What were the expectations? Because to make a acquisition of like that, you're obviously going all in for it. You're giving up players like Willie Pless going to the BC Lions. Were there a ton of expectations for the Toronto Argonauts going into the 1990 season? Obviously, the 91 season.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the book does get into a little bit into the stuff that happened leading up into 91. And of course, 89 was the year that the team moved into Sky Dome, which actually in retrospect was not a great move for the Argonauts. Although at the time it seemed like a really fabulous facility. But they had a bad team in 89. They were 7-11. They managed to get a home playoff game just because the East was weak that year. But they had a really terrible offense in 89, and the quarterbacking was really subpar. But they had some talent. I mean, 89 was the year Michael Clemens came to the CFL pinball, and they had Darrell K. Smith, who was one of the greatest receivers in Argonauts history, but they didn't have a quarterback. And so when they fired Bob Obilovich at the end of the 89 season, brought in Mike McCarthy as the general manager and Don Matthews as the head coach, the first thing those guys did was they said, we got to get a quarterback. And they went out and got the guy who was unquestionably at the time the best quarterback in Canadian football. This is before Doug Flutie got there. It was before Damon Allen got established. Matt Dunnigan was the marquee quarterback of the CFL throughout the second half of the 1980s. He'd played for Edmonton, taken them to a Grey Cup game that they lost. He'd taken actually 2 Grey Cup games, one that they won, but he got hurt in. Taken the BC Lions to the Grey Cup in 88, and they lost. He was the man. He was the best quarterback in Canadian football. He was the marquee star of the league. The Argos got him before the 1990 season, and they produced that year what I believe, and I say this in the book, was the greatest offense the CFL has ever seen. They scored 689 points, almost 40 points a game, which was what Don Matthews had brashly predicted. He had said at the start of the year, we're gonna average 40 points a game, and people are looked at him like, are you nuts? Like, you can't make a prediction like that. And they averaged 38.3 points a game. And that's with the fact that Dunnigan kept getting hurt. He got hurt 3 times that season, and they ended up using Ricky Foggy at quarterback. He wasn't even on the roster at the start of training camp. He was on the BC Lions, and the Lions got Doug Flutie in 1990, and they realized, okay, we got a good quarterback here, and they tried to convert Foggy to a slot back. And Mike Dunnigan got hurt, and Mike McCarthy plucked Foggy off the Lions practice roster, and before you know it, he was lighting it up. I mean, no training camp, but luckily he knew Adam Reid's offense. Adam was the offensive coordinator in 90. He knew the offense. And so when Dunnigan kept getting hurt, Foggy came in, and they didn't skip a beat. I mean, Foggy had a game where he threw 7 touchdown passes and ran for 100 yards himself. It's just unbelievable. So yeah, they were a lights out offensive machine in 1990. The only thing they couldn't do was beat the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. The Bombers finished first in the East. The Argos lost to them 4 times in the regular season. They lost to the rest of the league 4 times, and they lost to the Bombers 4 times. And then they went to the Eastern Final in Winnipeg. And even though they were down by that point to their, to their 5th string quarterback, they had to bring back Tom Porras because they kept, Dunnigan got hurt, Foggy got hurt, Willie Gillis got hurt, John Kangemi got hurt in that Eastern Final, and they were down to Tom Porras, the emergency break only in event of emergency quarterback. And he had them tied in 17-all late in the 4th quarter. And then there was a breakdown on the Argo defense. Tom Burgess, who was not a fast runner or a scrambler, somehow burst through for a 40-yard gain up the middle to set up the game-winning field goal for Trevor Kennard. And the Bombers ended up killing Edmonton in the Grey Cup a week later, 50-11. I'm sure the Argos would have killed them just as bad. They were that good. Even with a 5th-string quarterback, I believe they would have won the Grey Cup in 90. So then they get to 91, and now Matthews is gone. Rita takes over as head coach, and they add one more piece to the puzzle, Rocket Ismail. To the already extremely good offense, now you bring in the Rocket.
All right, I'm feeling nostalgia. All these names, like even Tom Porras, just bringing up that name is nostalgic. All right, so
the singing Elvis, right?
Yeah,
you had a great Elvis imitation.
Exactly, I do remember that. Yeah. So before the 91 season, the Toronto Argonauts had a change of ownership, and not only were these guys heavily financially backed, but these had some name value. We're talking Bruce McNall, Wayne Gretzky, and of course the one and only John Candy. How did the group get involved with buying the Toronto Argonauts?
Well, I say in the book that there's a lot of different stories and a lot of different memories about how it came about. One person says it was this person's idea, another person says it was that person's idea. And so we'll never get truly to the bottom of it. But I believe, after all the people I spoke to, that the likeliest scenario, we know Bruce McNall, who was the owner of the Los Angeles Kings, and he had brought Wayne Gretzky down to the Kings and turned hockey into a big deal in Southern California. We know he was on the board of directors at Hollywood Park Racetrack, and another member of the board of directors was Harry Ornest. And Harry had owned the Argos for 2 years, 89 and 90, and he was looking to get out of it. And he I believe, went up to Bruce one day and said, "Hey, I know you own the Kings. I've got a football team I'm looking to get rid of. Are you interested?" And McNall told me he had never heard of the Argos, but he called Wayne, and he knew Wayne was from Southern Ontario. And Wayne said, "Oh, Bruce, there's only one team worth owning in Canada. It's the Toronto Argonauts." And Bruce called John Candy, who was like the honorary captain of the Kings and a season ticket holder, and someone who accompanied Bruce to pregame meals at the Fabulous Forum all the time, and called Candy and told him. And John said, "Oh, man, I love the Argonauts. I wanted to play for them when I was a kid." So I think that's how it came about. They put together a bid and bought the team from from Ornest, and then suddenly, the Argos went from being owned by this kind of an odd duck. Ornest was an eccentric owner, shall we say, and all of a sudden they're owned by Hollywood royalty. By John Candy, the biggest star Canada's ever produced, and Wayne Gretzky, the greatest hockey player the world has ever seen, and Bruce McNall, who at the time was perceived as a Hollywood mogul with a Midas touch. Everything he touched turned to gold. And wow, it put the Argos on the front pages. They were on the front page of the New York Times and the front page of USA Today. And of course, in Canada, it was a humongous story when they came along.
Yeah, it almost seems like when you go through the list of ownerships, you're like John Candy, Wayne Gretzky, and then, well, knowing what we know now, then it's like Bruce McNall.
Yeah, we didn't know at the time that Bruce he didn't have as much money as everybody thought he did. That came up later, and there's a sad part of the book at the end where it all kind of falls apart. But at the time, it looked like this is the magic dust that Canadian football has needed.
All right, we're talking with Paul Woods, the author of The Year of the Rocket. When we think about the 1991 Grey Cup game, we remember the result, obviously Toronto beating Calgary. We remember Matt Dunnigan getting frozen for the purpose of getting out there again. And we obviously remember the 87-yard kickoff return for a touchdown. But when we talk about this game, the first thing that always comes to mind is a beer can or a snowball. And I remember being there. I was 11 years old when I was sitting in I believe the south end zone. Or I don't know. My directional information is probably not up to speed at this point. But I remember seeing the snowball almost coming near him, and then and this is what I was talking about, the things you remember that are not exactly 100% accurate. And then lo and behold, it's a beer can, and then there's a second snowball. Now, you've talked about this in the game. You're not going to or in the book, you're not going to name names, or if you have that information. Obviously, you met or you're caught up to the person. Is there like a story behind what happened with that?
Yeah, well, it was one of my quests as I set off on this project. I got to find who threw that beer can because it was a beer can. It wasn't a snowball, though. At the time, it looked like it might have been, and that's what Don Whitman called it on the CBC telecast of the game. But we'd known subsequently that it was a beer can, but nothing had ever been written about who threw this can and why. And so I set out on a quest to figure that out, and with help from some good folks in Winnipeg, including Doug Spears of the Winnipeg Free Press, who's a columnist there. People came forward and said, "Hey, I was sitting in the section. I can tell you what I saw, and I know who it was," and a whole lot of leads I had to hunt down, right? And I just basically methodically hunted down every lead that came forward. And in the end, I believe I spoke to the guy that threw the can. I mean, I can't prove it. I always make a point of saying, there's no corroborating evidence. It was 30 years ago. There's no way of proving one way or the other if this person really was the person who threw it. But based on the details I got from him and from a friend of his and from other people that were in the area, I think it was him. He doesn't want to be identified, and I respected that. We live in a world, as he said, where you can have the social media spotlight turned on you in a way that you don't enjoy. But he told me the story, and he basically said, I mean, he was a former Winnipegger who grown up as a Bomber fan. He'd moved to Calgary by 91. He was cheering for the West, because that's what you did. You cheered for your division, and actually everybody in that stadium, except maybe 1,000 people, was cheering for the Stampeders. It was the biggest anti-Argo crowd you're ever going to see, because people thought, they fat cats from Hollywood, they're buying the Grey Cup and all this stuff. And he was a guy, just add to the funny nature of the story, he was part of a group called the Gotchmen who went to Bombers games in wearing underwear. They would wear underwear on top of their clothing, or in the summer they just wear underwear. And they also used to smuggle beer into the stadium in their underwear. He smuggled some cans of beer in his mother's bra, which he was wearing. Even though you could buy beer at the stadium, but it was a Gotchmen tradition to smuggle beer in. So he had a few pops that day, and here it was. He was down in Section S, down in the one end of the field, the field that Rocket was running towards with that kickoff return. Rocket's running right towards him. He's watching this. He's thinking to himself, they're ruining the CFL. They bought the Grey Cup. I got a half-frozen can of beer in my bra, and he suddenly throws that thing onto the field, and he comes really close to hitting him. I mean, it just landed at his feet as he was about the 7-yard line on the way into the goal line. He says now, like, obviously it was kind of a stupid thing to do, and I wouldn't do it again. But at the time, he says, in a millisecond, it's amazing how many things pop through your mind. And the next thing you knew, he was throwing that beer. And it's a legend of Canadian history, Canadian sports history, and Canadian history that'll never be forgotten, right? And people think about that game, as you say, they talk about the beer can. And there was a second can, as you said, coming out of that end zone a few seconds later. And I didn't track down that thrower, but I got this guy, and it's a hell of a story, and it just adds to what was already an amazing story, for all the elements that we've talked about: Candy and Gretzky and Rocket and McNall and Dunnigan and the frozen, the broken collarbone and all that stuff. And then you got a frozen beer can that goes down in history, right? Yeah,
and then you mentioned he was inebriated. I guess you'd have to be in order to withstand the cold in that game. Man,
I guess so. They wouldn't wear parkas, these guys, but they had their underwear was on top of their clothing. That's for sure.
On an unrelated note, but a little bit more tearjerker, one of the members of the Grey Cup winning team before. Or with the 1991 Grey Cup team is Chris Schultz, legendary member of that team, as well as the CFL and TSN panel. Unfortunately, we just recently lost him, and I imagine that you did catch up with him when you were researching this book. Any Chris Schultz stories, if you have any, or if you had any conversations with him that, anything that you want to share with us?
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, it won't come to anybody's surprise. Anybody that watched Chris on TSN will not be surprised to hear that he was an incredibly articulate, insightful individual. He was one of the first guys I interviewed for the book. I ended up interviewing him 3 times. He told me some very, very fascinating and valuable, insightful stories about a lot of things. He had some interesting perspectives. I mean, he was one of the few players, for example, that was not a huge fan of Don Matthews as a head coach before 91. But Chris had a lot of stuff to say. We talked about the concussion that he suffered in the 91 Grey Cup. He was knocked cold. He was knocked unconscious on the field, got a knee to the head from a Calgary defensive lineman. The footage of him lying there looking glassy-eyed as Dunnigan is kneeling over trying to talk to him, and Schultz he's just vacant. He's gone. And he's first guy to say, like, they would never allow me to go back into the game nowadays, thankfully. But in those days, he was on the sideline for a while, and then he was back in that game. But yeah, Chris was, we're all really sorry that we lost him far too young. A very important part of that team, a guy who a good case can be made should be in the Canadian Football Hall of Fame. And he's one of a few guys that we've lost. I mean, Darrell K. Smith, one of the greatest receivers in Argonaut history, had also left us back in 2017 far too soon. Keith Kelly, Harold Hallman, R.D. Lancaster, Ron Lancaster Jr. was an assistant coach with the Argos back then. There's a few guys that we've lost. Doran Major, who was really was more of an Argo before '91, but he was still part of the scene in '91. In fact, he and Pinball Clemens were on the TSN show. Now I've got a brain cramp. I can't think of what the hell were they called anyway? They had a crazy halftime segment on TSN. It'll come to me before this talk is over. So we lost a few of them, but losing Chris was a terrible blow, especially so close to the 30th anniversary when a lot of those players and coaches are looking back with such fondness on that year, which for many of them, probably for most of them, was the greatest, most magical year of their careers.
Yeah, and it's unfortunately, like you mentioned, gone too soon.
It's the Homeboys, by the way. The Homeboys.
That's it. Okay.
You know what? Show with Pinball and Doran Major was Benny Feelgood and Jerome Love were the two stars.
I know. You know what's funny is because I remember the show. I remember as soon as you described everything. I don't think I really listened. Obviously, it was outside of the outside of our area, but I do remember hearing about it. Sometimes what I like to do is I like to play the what if game, right? So what if the pick six doesn't happen in that game? What if the kick return doesn't happen in a game? What if the Calgary Stampeders pull off the upset and win? Were there chatters of maybe because we're so much expectations, they have this new ownership, this new toy in the Rocket? Were there chatter that maybe heads were going to roll after the 91 season? Should they have not won that game?
I don't think so. I never heard anything along those lines. You got to remember that 91 was just such a magical ride for those guys. It was like everywhere they went, it was like the circus has come to town. John Candy was on the road with the team every week or at home games. When they got to other cities, the places really were interested in seeing them, and it really was like the Hollywood circus has arrived. And they sailed through the season with a lot of success, right? They were 13-5. They were undefeated at home, 10-0, including the Eastern Final. So I think at that point, nobody was thinking that anything could possibly go wrong. And it's funny when you talk about the what ifs. I mean, there are a lot of what ifs you could attach to that game. The Argos had 7 first downs. How do you win a Grey Cup game with 7 first downs? Calgary outgained them 400 and some odd yards to 174, I think. The Argos did score on Calgary's very first touch of the ball. Danny Barrett threw an interception right to Ed Berry. He took it 50 yards to the house. But it was 22-21 in the fourth quarter when Rocket scored that touchdown. It was down to a 1-point game. The momentum was with Calgary. And if Rocket hadn't uncorked that return, who knows? Maybe the Stampeders do win the game. But I don't think anybody was talking about heads rolling at that point. Now, I will tell you, and I get into this in the book, that behind the scenes, there were people in the executive office, the business office of the Argos, that were saying, this isn't going to work financially. And we didn't sell as many tickets as we needed to. They were counting on selling out Skydome every week. And they didn't do that. They had one crowd of 40,000 in game one, and they had one crowd of 50,000 in the playoff game, and everything else was in the 30s. And they needed to put 54,000 seats, people into those seats to really make it work financially with the money they were paying to Rocket. So the business office was worried before the season was even over that I don't know that we can get this thing to be successful financially. But on the field, I don't think there was any thought that Adam Rita or Mike McCarthy or Matt Dunnigan or anybody's heads would roll if things had not gone well in that game. Now, I will add one point, though. When after the season, Matt Dunnigan had played out his option, was a free agent, and there were people in head office saying, let's go with Ricky. Matt's always hurt, because he was always hurt. He was injured 6 times in 2 years. He only played 16 out of 36 regular season games for the Argos. And so people, the people in the front office were saying, we can't afford to pay this guy, the $500,000 that he's looking for. If he's going to be hurt all the time. And Ricky Foggy was unbelievable whenever we put him in there, so let's let him go. If they lost that game, that would have made it even easier for them to come to that conclusion. They came to that conclusion despite winning and despite the fact that Matt wrote the most heroic chapter I think has ever been written in Grey Cup history, playing that game with a broken collarbone on his throwing side and throwing 2 long touchdown passes.
All right. Yeah, and you know what? And from a business side, allowing Matt Dunnigan to enter free agency seemed to be the most cost-effective way to go. And it was probably the only time in recent memory that Cal Murphy was able to open his wallet for anything in regarding to the Blue Bombers. So we covered the what if. Let's discuss what happened after the 91 season. So we know Dunnigan left for free agency, and eventually a year after that, ownership would change hands, and I believe Candy McNall would sell. I could be wrong on that one, but it just seemed that Toronto went from Grey Cup champions to kind of like a blip on the radar in the CFL standard. So was there anything that happened that could be used to explain that, or was it just the magic of that 91 season just poof, just out of nowhere?
Well, there was that. The magic did sort of just poof. But letting Dunnigan go was obviously a mistake. I mean, as good as Ricky Foggy was, he was better as a backup quarterback who could play a lot than he was as the number one quarterback. They had spent all that money on the Rocket, and they tried to build an offense around the Rocket. It's hard to build an offense around a single wide receiver. You just can't target the guy enough to have your whole offense go funnel through that one player. It's often forgotten that not only did Dunnigan go, but they also lost to retirement Chris Gaines, and Chris Gaines was an unsung hero of that team. He was the heart and soul of the Argonauts in 90 and 91. He was the middle linebacker, the captain of the defense, the guy that led them in the pregame stuff every week by doing raps about that week's opponents, and then they would do all these crazy dances and backflips and all sorts of stuff the day before the game. That was all going through Chris Gaines. Jethro, as his nickname was, and he had to retire. He stood up in the locker room before the 91 Grey Cup and said, "Guys, I'm going to be serious for once. This is my last game. The doctors tell me I've got to quit or I'm not going to be able to walk." He had succession of ankle injuries going back to playing as a kid practically, and they said you're not going to be able to walk and hold your kids up if you keep playing. So he had to leave. And so losing the heart and soul of the defense and the heart and soul of the offense really hurt. And the sad thing is, off the field, winning that Grey Cup and having all that magic ride, it led people to sort of look elsewhere in Toronto. We had the success, we had the fun, we had the joy, we had the magic. And hey, guess what? The Blue Jays are really competitive now. And of course, sure enough, the Blue Jays actually won the World Series for the first time in 92. So people in Toronto turned their attentions elsewhere. Interest in the Argos went down in 92, which made it harder for management to figure out how to make this thing work financially. Rocket was getting less and less interested in doing the stuff they needed him to do in terms of helping promote the team. He was a great player on the field, but they needed him to be much more than that. They needed him to be the Wayne Gretzky of Canadian football or the Magic Johnson of Canadian football, and he was a shy guy who didn't want to be out before the press every week. And he was getting to the point by early in the 92 season that he was clearly not interested in being around. And so you add all that up, plus they had Foggy got hurt and Rocket got hurt, and other players got hurt, and there were even Adam Rita, who's they call him the Happy Hawaiian. He's the nicest man you'll ever meet and fantastic head coach and the perfect coach for that team in 91. He lost his patience a few times. He got into a big argument with Darrell K. Smith at one point in August, and so bad that Darrell K. Smith thought he'd been cut. So a whole lot of things went wrong. Adam got fired a few weeks after Labor Day, and the reigning Grey Cup champion and the reigning coach of the year was gone before the next season was even over. It just went to hell. They went from 13-5 in the Grey Cup to 6-12, and a whole lot of bad stuff happened, including the worst of all, Rocket stomping on Andy McVeigh's head on the sidelines at Skydome. It just went bad. And then just to wrap up the time frame, the McNall Group did still own the team for another full season. Right through the 93 season, they were still there, despite the fact that Bruce's financial empire was collapsing. The team actually changed hands in April of 1994, which was 2 months after John Candy sadly died. And if you talk about a what if, I often wonder what if John had been able to buy the team, and maybe he doesn't go down to Mexico and shoot that movie, and maybe he doesn't suffer a heart attack and die. Who knows, right? But that's where the story ends, basically, at John Candy standing on the desert in Mexico, listening to a satellite phone where his agent is telling him the team's been sold, and then a couple days later he's dead.
Well, Paul, I could listen to stories about this early time frame. This is like my happy place in regards to my CFL fandom. That's the year of the Rocket, John Candy, Wayne Gretzky, A Crooked Tycoon, and the Craziest Season in Football History by Paul Woods. Out September 1st. You could pre-order it today for a discount through Sutherland Homes. Use the promo code ROCKET20. Paul, thanks. I feel like I learned a lot more than I thought I did. Thanks for agreeing to come on today's show, and hope the sales go through the roof for you in September.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. It's been a lot of fun. It's always fun to talk about this stuff. Just to correct one thing, Sutherland House is the name of the publishing company. It's also available for pre-order through all the other channels, through Chapters Indigo, Amazon, you name it. But if you go to Sutherland House, you will get the 20% discount. And I look forward to hearing what people think of the book when they've got it in their hands. I'm looking forward to getting it in my own hands. I haven't got it yet. But it's a hell of a story, and I feel honored to have had the privilege of telling it. And I hope people enjoy it as much as I enjoyed working on it.
Oh, I can't wait to read it myself. Paul, thanks again for coming on, and like I said, hopefully the sales go through the roof.
Well, thank you so much, Robert. Really happy to do it.